Hello, this lecture is called Latin History. When you learn Latin, one thing you might notice is how familiar many of the words seem, while the grammar and syntax seem quite, though maybe not completely, alien. With this presentation, I want to answer two questions. How is Latin related to English and other contemporary languages? And why has Latin been so important in history? There have been millions of languages spoken throughout history, and this one particular language, after a couple thousands of years, is still with us both directly as a language that is used in its entirety, for instance with the Catholic Mass or the Latin oration at Harvard graduations, and also indirectly in scientific names and borrowed words. There are also a number of words we use that just sound kind of Latinish, so why is that? Well, there are a couple of reasons. The first is that English and Latin, along with German, Russian, Greek, Persian, Hindi, and many other languages, both current and extinct, share some distant yet nevertheless common origins. Similar to how French, Italian, and Spanish are all descended from Latin, English, Hindi, and many others are all apparently descended from a language that linguists refer to as Proto-Indo-European. Now, I'm hedging a bit here by saying similar, that is, not identical, and apparently, because Proto-Indo-European is a language reconstructed, or a skeptic might say invented or even made up, by academics. That is to say, nobody really knows if the words reconstructed as Proto-Indo-European really existed, or if that language was really spoken. Now, something like those words probably did exist, but probably not as a unified language. It seems that sometime, several thousand years ago, about 6,000 years ago, there were some tribes around the Black Sea here that were speaking something like Proto-Indo-European, just these areas here, the Crimea and the Caucasus and northern Asian Minor on the Black Sea. They spoke this series of dialects, and this tribe subsequently expanded in pretty much every direction and took their language with them. So as you can see, some of them headed southeast towards the subcontinent. Others stayed in Iran. In fact, Persian, the Iranian, that Iran even means land of the Aryans. And in fact, one of the 19th century terms for Indo-European was Aryan. That's why the Germans, or that is, you should say, the Nazis, like to call themselves Aryans. They were the first master people and so forth who conquered all this territory. Now, the ironic part is that Germanic languages that are basically around here, that is, Swedish, Norwegian, what eventually becomes English here as Anglo-Saxon, and then of course German, Dutch, and so forth. These appear to be Creole languages. They're not in any way directly descended from Indo-European. That is, they seem to have multiple ancestors, which is normal. But it doesn't speak well to the purity of your lineage, whatever that means. So there's also, by the way, another term for Indo-European, because the reason, what does Indo-European mean? Well, okay, here's Indo, the easternmost language group, like Sanskrit and modern Hindi and so forth, and here are all the European, all the way here, all these European languages that are also belong to the same basic group. But the problem is, while the Indo refers to a definite and a defined group of languages, European is not a coherent category, because you also have in Europe the Finns, who speak a language that is not Indo-European, or the Hungarians, who are nowadays somewhere around here, who do not speak Indo-European language. And also the Basques, by the way, in northern Spain, do not speak an Indo-European language. So some critics will say, well, it doesn't make sense to call this language group Indo-European. It makes sense to call them Indo, again, for the easternmost language group, Indo-Germanic for the westernmost language group. And maybe you won't be surprised to learn that it's mostly Germans who are promoting this idea. Now, you're probably thinking, wait a minute, shouldn't these be called Indo-Celtic languages? Celtic languages are further west. But thousands of years after the initial Indo-European expansion, some Norwegians, right here, got on a boat, or got on several boats, and left west towards Iceland. And so that's why Germanic reaches further west. But of course, Iceland isn't on this map here. Well, anyway, academics and their nationalities, they never get over themselves. So, you can therefore see some pretty strong similarities between Latin and Germanic languages like English. Here are some examples. Now, the main thing here is not to say, for instance, hey, English have and Latin capere, like right here, here's English have and Latin capere, don't look very similar. Shouldn't English have be correlated with the Latin verb habere? There is a Latin verb habere, which in fact means to have. And maybe you'll be surprised that English have has etymologically nothing to do with the Latin verb habere. It's the Latin verb capere, which is to take. The answer is that just eyeballing the word isn't good enough. When languages change, they change in regular ways. So one sound shift that is well known, in fact it's called Grimm's Law for Jakob Grimm of fairy tale fame, he was primarily a linguist by trade, is that when you have a C, like in Canis, in Latin, or in other languages like Latin, like maybe Greek, you'll have an H in Germanic languages like hound in English, or German Hund. Or you'll have, or centum, you get 100, or actually any number, a lot of numbers correlate, or here capere and have. So that's just one example of a sound shift. We won't go into the details here. There are other rules that play into this, and we don't need to know them all. If you're interested, you can ask me about them. I just want you to get a general idea that English and Latin share some distant roots and therefore share a number of words that, well, you probably wouldn't just look at them and say, oh, these are similar words. But through scientific exploration, these relationships have been determined. You can see it. You see the relationship also in inflections too. How the words change. Okay, all this stuff about nominative, genitive, dative, and accusative and ablative. We'll get to that. Don't worry so much about it. But you see, it's just like in English when you have a word like a pronoun like he, that turns to him. He loves her, she loves him. It changes depending on its role in the sentence. That is called syntax. We'll get into that a little bit later. Don't worry about it too much right now. But you can see how these endings change, right? In Latin you have hostis, and in Gothic, which is an extinct Germanic language, so it's related to English. Gast, which is the word guest, by the way, and just so you know, hostis is enemy, as in hostile. So it's a general word for foreigner, right? Somebody who might be your guest or your enemy. So, and you can see there's s here, a vowel in the dative, in the accusative. Well, here it's in Latin you get an M. You don't get anything in Gothic, and then there's no ablative in Gothic. But then again, you come back here and you get this vowel plus an S here too, and some other similarities too. Though again, also quite different. This is in the plural, by the way. This here is singular, and all this here is the plural. So there are some changes, some similarities there too. And here's some more ones, like these are both the words for hand here in Gothic. Handus, manus. The roots are different, right? See very clearly, the roots are different, but the endings can be quite similar. Here in the dative, a vowel. Again, the accusative comes out a little bit differently, but still get that U there. And again, in the plural again, down here, and here again, this is the singular. You have manus and handus again. And here you have these weird, a double U, literally a double U, and here a double U in the genitive. So you can see there are some real similarities here. Accusative, us, and here you just get an extra N in there. So there's some real similarities to how these languages, not only how the vocabulary, but how the languages work. So, okay, we're saying Latin is related to English, but why did English borrow so much from Latin? All these words here, I'll go back one. All these words here, these are cognates, that is, words that share common origins. What about derivatives? That is, words that have been borrowed from one language to the other. I'll tell you what, Latin did not borrow any words from the Anglo-Saxons or the Germans, right? They borrowed words from Latin. And that's why we in English have so many, and also in German and Dutch, have so many words from Latin, or also eventually French too. Why do we have so many of those? Well, here's Italy in 500 BC, and you can see that the language family here, Italic, speakers of Italic right here in the green. Here, down here, you have Greeks speaking Greek, some other, the Veneti and so forth. Up here, you have the Etruscans and so forth. So you can see Italy was a rather diverse place linguistically, not to mention ethnically and culturally. But you can see Latin here, Latini right here. This is about where Rome is. It's not. It's an important language there. It's in the middle of Italy, but it's not the dominant language. Now, if we go a little bit further into history, and you can see here what I wrote here. Latin started out as a dialect of the Italic family. It was about 500 BC. And Rome is here a relatively insignificant city-state on the world stage with little in the way of history. We go here, though, all of a sudden, 600 years later or so, we have the Roman Empire under Trajan, when generally speaking, the empire was at its most expansive in terms of territory and population. And of course, this is why Latin is such an important language, because the Romans managed to do this. Now, of course, in this area here, in Armenia, Latin never really took hold, right? They kept speaking Armenian. And of course, in the east, basically along here, they kept speaking Greek. This would be about the dividing line here. They kept speaking Greek on this side. Of course, you could go all the way from Britain up here in Britain all the way down to Egypt and still use Latin, or in North Africa all the way up to parts of the Ukraine and still use some Latin. But generally speaking, there was a linguistic divide here that this here would all be speaking. You'd be speaking Greek here and Latin over here. And Latin, and of course all the vernaculars. It's not like they stopped speaking Celtic over here, right? Wales, they still speak Welsh, which is Celtic. Or now we don't have time to tell the story of of how Rome got to be this way. That is how Rome managed to conquer so much territory. But if you're interested in finding out how this one city-state conquered about a quarter of the world's population, well, there are plenty of books on it. But one avenue I might suggest, if you're strapped for time, and I will provide a link to this on D2L, is Mike Duncan's History of Rome podcast. You can hear all about the ups, downs, and the final decline of the Roman Empire, all while driving or jogging or whatever it is you do. So this is how Western Europe, beyond just this territory around Rome in central Italy, that's how Western Europe was introduced to the use of Latin and how Latin became dominant there. But at this point, Latin was a language of literature and administration. Some philosophy, some science is written in Latin, but science and philosophy, well, that was still mostly the domain of Greek. So our story has to continue. And it's really important here that the story continues with the dissolution of the political and military power of Rome in the West. And you can see, actually, we should go back to this dividing line here. This dividing line became something of a formal barrier, a formal border between the eastern and western half of the Roman Empire, that is an administrative border, so that you had emperors in the east and emperors in the west that were supposed to be cooperating, but it really turned into something of a formal border. So you almost had two empires by the 4th century, the 4th and 5th centuries, or even the 3rd century, as I wrote here, is when it started. And a little after that, Western intellectuals like Augustine here, this is Saint Augustine, or Augustine as he's usually known. I prefer the pronunciation Augustine. He never learned Greek, at least not very well. And the reason for that is that border, Western intellectuals had a harder time learning Greek at this point, or by this point, because that border was because communication between the eastern and western half of the empire was getting harder. So, and it doesn't get any easier. This is Europe in about 500 AD, and by this point the Roman Empire is really, falling apart. Different barbarian groups are wandering into Roman territory and taking over. In fact, you don't even really have a Roman Empire in the West anymore. You have the Kingdom of the Ostrogoths in Italy here. Then you have the Burgunds in parts of France and Germany and Switzerland, and the Kingdom of the Franks up here, England, or the British Isles, pretty much taken over by the Angles and the Saxons and other Germanic groups. The Visigoths are here in Spain, Vandals in North Africa. This is not to say that the Roman Empire ceased to exist. Here it's labeled the Byzantine Empire, but the Byzantine Empire is just the Greek-speaking East, the Greek-speaking part of the Roman Empire, and it goes on for quite a long time after the West has fallen apart. But even though the administration of the West fell apart, and in effect Rome ceased to be the capital of the East, and there ceased to be a politically unified empire in the West, the cultural power of Latin continued, particularly in the Roman Church. And it was often through the Church that Latin culture and language were restored or retained in the West. So that 1,000 years later, when the Renaissance and scientific revolution occurs, guys like Copernicus and Newton and Kepler, well, they all wrote in Latin. Here's Newton's Principia, one of the foundational texts on physics and mathematics and so forth, written in Latin. Of course, you can read it in English. It's been translated, but Newton originally wrote it in Latin. Now, in England and France, the national vernaculars, namely English and French, overtook Latin as an academic language fairly early on. That is the 17th century, maybe. But in German-speaking territories, professors were lecturing in Latin right into the 19th century, and in Finland, Latin was used into the 20th century, and even after national vernaculars overtook or replaced Latin, the Latin roots of most scientific disciplines established in the 16th and 17th centuries remained such that much of our academic and scientific vocabulary is from Latin. That's the end of my introduction to Latin and history. I hope you learned something from this. The point is not to master the history of Latin, it's just to get a little idea so that you know where things are coming from. So next up, I'll give a little introduction to learning Latin.